During Donald Trump's presidency, news media came under attack. But what some of you might not know is that news media was already under attack in the United States and around the world by something much more complex and invisible: the rise of the ad tech industry.
One of the things that made Spotlight so powerful is the knowledge that the newspaper industry today is in big trouble. Papers have been closing and downsizing for years, and that affects all of us. Even if you only get your news from Facebook, Google, Twitter, or Arianna Huffington's Block Quote Junction and Book Excerpt Clearinghouse, those places are often just repackaging the work of newspapers, and it is not just websites. Watch how often TV news ends up citing print sources.
According to the Chicago Tribune.
According to the Detroit Free Press.
According to the San Francisco Chronicle.
According to the Times-Picayune.
The Boston Globe.
The Orlando Sentinel.
The Philadelphia Inquirer.
The Pittsburgh Tribune Review.
The Detroit News.
And the Houston Chronicle reports.
The Los Angeles Times reports. The Oklahoman reports. The Hartford Courant reports. The Salt Lake Tribune reports.
It's pretty obvious, without newspapers around to cite, TV news would just be Wolf Blitzer endlessly batting a ball of yarn around. And it is not just news outlets. Stupid shows like ours lean heavily on local papers. In fact, whenever this show is mistakenly called journalism, it is a slap in the face to the actual journalists whose work we rely on.
You know those annoying ads which pop up on whichever website you are visiting? Those are controlled by the ad tech software or programmatic advertising. Now, understanding how ad tech software works is pretty complex, and we'll get into it at another point. But for now, let's look at how ad tech influences publishers and why policymakers are working hard to protect news publishers from ad tech companies. Now, according to Pew Research, newsroom employment only in the United States decreased by 23% between 2008 and 2019. Now, that is a lot of unemployed journalists. But it's not just journalists. Newsrooms are populated by editors, analysts, photographers, and whatnot. Now, another statistic to look at is that majority of these job losses were after 2014, and they were in the newspaper industry. Combined newsroom employment in the other four news-producing industries, broadcast television, radio, cable, and digital native, remain relatively stable, even rising modestly after 2014. That kind of makes sense though, doesn't it? Because the way we consume news has changed drastically over the last few years. We get majority of our news now from a mobile or laptop. In fact, majority of Americans, up to 86%, consume news online, and the number is similarly rising around the world. News sources have also become highly diversified because of the internet and online technology, so people like me and you can set up programs and say that we are presenting news and facts instead of a few companies holding all access to information. Now, that is a solid argument being made by Facebook and Google that news consumption habits have changed and that news organizations need to evolve their business models in order to keep up with the times. And that is why we see more and more news organizations asking us to subscribe to their content and putting up paywalls so that we can access 2-3 articles at a time and have to pay to see more in a month or a week or whatnot. But let's take a step back and think about the news business model. Up until a decade ago, we were getting majority of our news from TV, radio, or newspapers, right? Also, if we were buying or selling something, ads appeared in the newspaper such as classifieds. So basically, apart from subscriptions, news organizations were making majority of their revenue from ads. So for instance, if you're selling a toaster, right, you'll put an ad in a newspaper so that people learn that you're selling a toaster. But what would you do now? You'd put the ad on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. Or let's say there's a big brand like Coca-Cola. Their ad would appear in the middle of nightly news hour, right? How it worked was that news and advertisers were more in touch with one another, and they also had editorial control in the news organization so that they could decide what ad appears where. For the last decade, though, this process has been taken over by software, and ads are placed automatically through something called real-time bidding. Now, real-time bidding is a very interesting concept, but for now, let's just say that the middleman is now software industry. So if you search for a product online or Googled it, that ad starts popping up all across your websites or inside your Facebook feed, and that is being done through this kind of process. Now, here is the most important statistic. According to the World Advertising Research Council, in 2020, Facebook and Google hoovered up over 70% of the $300 billion spent globally on digital advertising. Facebook and Google have majority control over all of the digital advertising supply chain, as they have been buying up companies which serve ads like DoubleClick over the last few years. They are an ad tech global duopoly. Now, this brings up 2 points. One is that the global digital ads market is growing exponentially. In fact, by 2024, the global ad market value is expected to reach $769.9 billion. Other tech players like Amazon and Twitter have also started to inch their way into the advertising technology market. Now, let's throw in some more numbers for context. In 2020, Facebook's revenue jumped 20% to roughly $86 billion from $70.7 billion in 2019. In 2020, Google's ad revenue amounted to $146.9 billion US. What is Google and Facebook's business model? It is mostly dependent on ad revenue from ad tech. Why are they so dominant? It's because Google and Facebook have the largest reservoirs of user data and user habits, which incentivizes advertisers to use their services. Or can we say that they are left with no other choice? In response to multiple EU fines and US lawsuits, Google is now claiming that 70% of the ad revenue goes to publishers. But researchers disagree because they find it very difficult to verify this number given the opaque nature of the advertising supply chain and the decreasing publisher revenues. You might ask at this point that if newsroom jobs are stabilizing, then why is this a problem? According to a new PwC Media Outlook report, global newspaper advertising, print and online, will fall from $49.2 billion in 2019 to $36 billion in 2024, a decline of more than a quarter or 27% over a period of 5 years. Global circulation and subscriber revenue is also expected to fall from $58.7 billion in 2019 to $50.4 billion in 2024. So while news revenues are declining, ad tech revenues are increasing. So that is the context within which regulators are coming after Facebook and Google in particular, and lawmakers are citing publishers' revenue as one of the main reasons that they need to be regulated. This is also why recently Facebook decided to pull news linking from its platform in Australia, but after much uproar decided to stay put. And this is also why Google is launching Google News Showcase with an investment of $1 billion over 3 years so that they can start licensing news content with partnerships with over 400 companies already. Now, while regulations and lawsuits are still under debate in many European countries and the United States, Australia is the first country which has actually passed a news revenue sharing law, which we will be discussing on a different episode. But for now, let's use the US as a use case, as the United States is the largest programmatic advertising market in the world, and these companies are based out of here. In 2019, the Journalism Preservation and Competition Act was introduced in Congress. This was in relation to a News Media Alliance report, which is claiming that Facebook and Google made $4.8 billion in revenue from news publishers' content.
Fundamentally, our readership is at its highest levels ever. But while news organizations continue to invest heavily in generating critically valuable reporting, a few dominant companies in the digital ecosystem ensure that little value is returned to publishers. The government cannot regulate the news business under the First Amendment, but there are now 2 companies in particular, Google and Facebook, that clearly do regulate us. Their algorithms determine when and if news is seen in search results and news feeds. They determine how news is presented to readers. They collect and control data about our news audiences, and they control the systems and markets around digital advertising.
This law was reintroduced a couple of weeks back, and it was also introduced in Senate back then with bipartisan support. Journalism Competition and Preservation Act seeks to provide temporary safe harbor from antitrust regulations to enable news publishers to negotiate with big tech companies for a more balanced model for revenue sharing. The European Union is also close to passing the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. These laws could be amended as they pass through the European Union Parliament and include some elements from the Australian law that was recently passed. These include the option of binding arbitration for licensing agreements and requiring tech companies to inform publishers about changes to how they rank stories on their sites, thus giving publishers a heads up if these tech companies change their algorithms so that news stories might not appear in the same area as before. In response to all these regulations, Google and Facebook have upped their attempts to start licensing news content, with Google claiming that it sends users to news websites 24 billion times a month.